Exactly 2 days ago, I had the unique opportunity to meet with Mr. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is, of course, currently running for president on the Democrat ticket. And we discussed many of the topics that Americans are interested in, including the Second Amendment, massive inflation, the flood of illegal immigrants at the U.S. southern border, the weaponization of the NSA, the FBI, as well as the CIA, how we could actually end the Ukraine-Russia war, and so on and so forth. It was a phenomenal discussion. And before I play it for you, let me give you a quick backstory because it's quite relevant. You see, despite an almost complete media blackout against him, well, RFK Jr. is doing quite well. According to the most recent CNN poll, around 20% of Democrat voters support RFK Jr. as their presidential candidate. And in that same poll, by the way, an additional 44% said that they would consider supporting him. Now, that is obviously significant. But what's more significant is the pushback that he's receiving from the establishment. For instance, if you happen to turn on CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, or any other of the major networks, well, then you might notice that there is almost a complete media blackout against RFK Jr. They do not give him the time of day. Despite the fact that he's polling at 20%, they pretend he doesn't exist. That's, by the way, happening at the same time that CNN is giving primetime coverage to the likes of Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Tim Scott, and Asa Hutchinson, all of whom have tiny polling numbers in the Republican primaries. And so, RFK Jr. has about 20% in the Democrat polls, and he's ignored, while at the same time, Mike Pence has about 2% in the Republican polls, and he has an 8 p.m. primetime town hall over at CNN. It's funny how all that works. However, it's not only the mainstream media doing all the censoring, because big tech is at it as well. In fact, just one day before I got a chance to sit down with Mr. RFK Jr., well, Instagram suspended his official presidential campaign page. Here's specifically what RFK Jr. released in a statement on Friday. Quote, "Interesting. When we use our Team Kennedy email address to set up Instagram accounts, we get an automatic 180-day ban. Can anyone guess why that's happening? Instagram still hasn't reinstated my account, which was banned years ago with more than 900,000 followers. To silence a major political candidate is profoundly undemocratic. Social media is the modern equivalent of the town square. How can democracy function if only some candidates have access to it?" And indeed, if you head on over to Instagram today, his official campaign page is nowhere to be found. And so, with all that as the preface, with the censorship from the corporate media outlets, as well as from big tech, well, it was a privilege to sit down and speak with Mr. RFK Jr. myself. And there's one other thing that I'll quickly mention, since we are, of course, publishing this episode on YouTube. Nothing in this interview and nothing in this episode regarding the vaccines should be construed as medical advice. I'm not a doctor, this is not a medical show, and you should make your own decisions regarding the drugs and the vaccines that you might or might not take. I think it goes without saying that RFK Jr.'s position is his opinion based on his many years of research. And his opinion happens to differ from the mainstream establishment. If you'd like to go deeper into his research, I'll throw several links down into the description box below this video. It'll be several of the links he mentioned in the interview. And if you'd like to go deeper into them, you can at your own leisure. And so again, to any YouTube censors that might be watching, nothing in this episode can be construed as medical advice. And now, with all that out of the way, take a quick moment to smash those like and subscribe buttons and enjoy the interview. Mr. Kennedy, thank you so much for joining us here in Facts Matter.
Pleasure to be here.
So the first question is, let's say you get elected, you're in the Oval Office, what is the first thing you're doing?
I think it's better to think about what I do in the first month. I bring together Republican Democrat leadership and talk to them about developing a bipartisan agenda, and to address some of the issues that we can all agree on, and including issues like the border, which and election integrity. Instead of arguing about what's happened in the past or whose fault it is, let's solve those problems now. We all agree a nation can't exist if it has a pervious border. It's one of the first duties of the country, and we know we can solve the election issues. We had there, I was 4 days ago, I was in Nevada and Las Vegas, and that's an entire city that's built on, its capacity to create machines that actually count correctly. And every corner in every major city in our country has ATM machines that never give you too much money. We can build machines that work. We can have the safety valve of paper ballots, and we should all be able to agree on those things. Everybody ought to have a right to vote, and everybody's vote should be counted, and no vote should be overcounted. I'd also go to the regulatory agencies and start the process of unraveling corporate capture at those agencies. And this means all the regulatory agencies, from the public health agencies like NIH, CDC and FDA, the environmental agencies, the EPA, the Department of Transportation. I'm right now involved with, I'm representing 1,000 families in Columbiana County, Ohio, whose lives were upended by the Norfolk Southern spill. And that was a product, that's a symptom of corporate capture. The Department of Agriculture, which is favoring producers that are giving us unhealthy food, these big factory farms, the chemical agriculture industry, the fertilizer heavy agricultural industries, instead of doing what it was created to do, which is to benefit and support small family farmers and to give us Americans a healthy, wholesome food supply. And then also the enforcement agencies like FBI and CDC and the CIA, to begin the process of reorganizing those agencies and getting them back to what they're supposed to be doing, which is providing national security to our country rather than interfering with the electoral process and spying on Americans, who are, particularly the CIA. It's been illegal for most of their history to spy on Americans, and we need to make that illegal again.
Yeah. Regarding the southern border, what would you do with the tens of millions of people who are already illegally here in the country? So there's two aspects, right? Securing the border and dealing with the people who are here.
I don't think anybody can talk about credibly about giving amnesty or any other of those solutions until we can assure Americans that the borders are closed. And I think that's a secondary issue, and it's one that it's a lot easier to solve with a lot less poison and vituperation if Americans know that the borders are now sealed. And I don't think there's anything we can do until we do that.
Mm-hmm. So you would be open to giving them amnesty if some kind of a deal would be reached on closing the border?
Those are all things that need to be discussed after the border is closed. And I don't think any American is going to be happy with any solution until we make sure that that the border is closed.
All right, I wanted to pause the interview real quick to introduce the sponsor of today's episode by showing you this little piece of money. Or rather, I should say that this is fake money being printed into oblivion by those geniuses over in Washington, D.C. And so before they completely obliterate your life savings, what I recommend you do is to convert that fake money into real money, which is physical gold and silver. And the best company to use is the sponsor of today's episode, American Hartford Gold, who also happens to be my own personal gold and silver bullion dealer. Now, American Hartford Gold is one of the best companies in the game. Besides myself, they have thousands of other 5-star ratings across the country. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. They ship quickly, directly to your doorstep. Their product listings are awesome. They're stacked with great options of gold and silver bullion and coins. And best of all, they have amazing customer service. When you pick up the phone and call them, you feel good because not only do they have friendly staff, but they're a patriotic company that actually sponsors a program like ours, so you feel good knowing you support a company that supports the truth getting out into the wider American audience. And so calling them up is a no-brainer. But best of all, if you tell them that Roman sent you, they will throw in up to $5,000 worth of free silver with your first purchase. So giving them a call is a real no-brainer. So hit them up. It's 866-242-2352. That's 866-242-2352, or you can simply text the word Roman, R-O-M-A-N, Roman, to 65532. Roman to 65532. Of course, all their details will be down in the description box below. And now, let's head on back to the studio. What's your opinion right now of the Democratic primary? Because I know back in 2016, it was essentially rigged in favor of Hillary Clinton. 2020 was the pandemic and all the mess that happened because of that. And this year, not only are the primaries essentially without any debates, but the order of the primaries has been changed to favor the establishment candidate. So what's your opinion? How can you still win?
I don't think it's a good thing for our democracy, the optics both internationally and within our country. There's so many Americans now believe that the whole system is rigged against them, and that particularly our electoral system is rigged. And I think it's incumbent upon political leaders of both the Democratic and Republican Party to conduct elections in ways that, Americans, that reaffirm our nation's commitment to democracy. And that means not having a few people, a handful of people in the political party like they do in the Soviet Union, pick the political candidates and tell us what is permissible and not permissible. I think we should have democracy. We should have town halls. We should encourage politicians to actually go meet with Americans, particularly Americans, middle-class Americans, to go to the diners, to go to the gas stations, to go to the nail salons, to the barber shops, and really hear what the desperation that people in this country are feeling right now. I don't think it's good for our country to have the kind of elections where politicians go out and get $1 billion from billionaires and then carpet bomb the country with advertising and have a few heavily orchestrated rallies in front of hand-picked, highly screened audiences, and it's kind of a kabuki theater of democracy instead of real democracy. I think we should have a contest, and that it's better for our country to have debates, to have a real contest, and to be engaging in retail politics.
So prior to this interview, I asked our audience here at the Epoch Times what they would want to ask you. So I have a number of great questions from them. Here's one. This one actually came up over and over again. Ask RFK Jr., what is his stance on abortion? If you were president, would you sign an abortion ban if it were to cross your desk? Or conversely, would you sign a bill which codifies abortion into law? So either one.
Yeah, I feel the same way about abortion as I do about other issues of medical freedom. I've been fighting for medical freedom for 20 years, and I think people need to have autonomy of their own bodies. I think it's very dangerous when the state tells us what we can and cannot do with our own bodies. So I think, until a fetus is viable, so for the first 3 months, it needs to be the woman's choice and not the state's choice. And I at the same time, I've seen the photos of late-term abortions. I'm very troubled and disturbed by them. But I don't think it's a good thing I think the government is not the entity that we want telling people what they can and cannot do with their bodies. It needs to be left up to the woman.
And speaking of, you mentioned the issue of choice. So prior to you entering this race and this political arena, you were a large advocate for informing people about vaccinations and the ramifications of them. Now, when you do interviews, like I saw that interview you did with Breaking Points, and that's very indicative of how these interviews typically go. They ask you, they say, you're spreading misinformation. You say, well, can you show me any evidence that I am? And they just kind of yell over you. But it seems like in terms of the mainstream media narrative that's coming out about your work, the general public is not getting an accurate representation of what it is that you're saying. So if somebody were to, let's say, what happened to stumble upon this video right now, this interview between you and I right now, what would you tell someone who has only heard the mainstream media's view of your views on vaccines?
Yeah, what I would say is what I've always said, which is I'm not anti-vaccine any more than I'm anti-medicine. Medicine, pharmaceutical products are now the third leading cause of death in this country after cancer and heart attacks. And so pharmaceutical products, we all know, can be dangerous. And what I would say is let's adequately test them and let's inform the public. Let's be transparent with the public. And unfortunately, the vaccines are the one medicine that is exempt from pre-licensure safety testing. So before they market the vaccine, before they give it to our children, none of the vaccines have been properly safety tested. In fact, the COVID vaccine, which everybody looks at and understands that the safety testing was inadequate, but it is the best tested vaccine of any in history. So most of the vaccines, we now mandate 72 vaccines to American children, 72 doses, 16 vaccines. When I was a kid, I got 3 vaccines. I was fully compliant. But my kids got 72 vaccines. And not one of those vaccines had to go through a pre-licensing placebo-controlled safety trial that looks at health outcomes between vaccinated population and unvaccinated. It's very important to have those kind of studies, and particularly long-term studies, 5 or 6 or more years, because a lot of the injuries from vaccines are long-term injuries. They could be cancers, neurological disorders, autoimmune injuries, and allergic injuries, allergies like food allergies that come from vaccines. And you may not get a diagnosis for years afterward. And so without long-term safety trials, you can't understand the real risk profile of that product, and you cannot say that that product is averting more problems than it's causing. And let me give you one example. The most common vaccine, the most popular vaccine in the world today is the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine, DTP. We had it in this country and in Europe, but it has been pulled because it was causing so many injuries. 1 out of every 300 children were getting brain damage or were killed by it. But it's still given by the WHO and by Bill Gates to 161 million African children every year, and to similar numbers of South Asian children. And Bill Gates has claimed, he's kind of the godfather of that vaccine. He claims that the vaccine has saved 30 million lives. And he asked the Danish government in 2017 to support this DTP program, to pay for these inoculations to all these African kids. And the Danish government said, show us the data that show you're actually saving lives. Gates was unable to produce any. So the Danish government went to West Africa, and they have very good clinics there, and they had 30 years of data. And what they found was, and in one of those countries, Guinea-Bissau, exactly half the kids were vaccinated between 2 years and 3 years old, and half were not. So they had a perfect natural experiment, and they had 30 years of data. And when they looked at that data, they found that girls who got that vaccine were 10 times more likely to die in the next 6 months than children who didn't. And the girls were dying of things that none, the families, the doctors, the clinics, nobody had ever connected the dots to the vaccine. They weren't dying of diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. They were protected against the target diseases. They were dying of bilharzia, anemia, malaria, sepsis, small cuts and bruises, and most of them from pulmonary illnesses like pneumonia. And what the researchers said, the Danish government and Novo Nordisk, a vaccine company, paid for these studies, and they recruited the best researchers in the world, Peter Aaby, Sigrid Morgensen, very, very pro-vaccine scientists. They were shocked. And they said, this vaccine is killing more children than diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis was before the introduction of the vaccine. And the vaccine was protecting children from diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, but it had ruined their immune systems. So they were now susceptible to minor injuries and diseases, which were killing them and were not killing unvaccinated children. And that is the problem. If you're just looking at this and say, oh, it stops measles, you're not looking at, oh, does it cause, neurological disorders? Does it cause autoimmune diseases that are much, much worse than measles population-wide? And that's why you need that kind of testing. Now, I've said for many years, none of those tests exist, not one of them. And I met with Anthony Fauci in 2016 when I was going to serve on a vaccine safety commission for Donald Trump. President Trump forced Fauci and Collins to meet with me and Del Bigtree and Aaron Siri. And during that meeting, I said to him, for many years, Tony, you have said that when I have said not one of these vaccines have ever been tested, safety tested, you've said that I was not telling the truth, that I was promoting misinformation. Can you show us a test from any of those vaccines? He made a show of looking through these Redwell files that he had that they had rolled in from NIH on a cart.
They rolled them in specifically for this question of yours?
No, they rolled them in for the entire meeting. So he had bought an entire little cart with dozens and dozens of file folders for kind of what was going to be a debate on vaccine safety. And there was a referee from the White House, from the West Wing there. who was listening to both sides. And so I said, I posed the question, can you show us one? And he made a kind of show of looking through the files for those studies. And he said, I can't find any at the moment. They're back in Bethesda. I'll send them to you. Well, of course he never did. So Del and Aaron, Siri, and I sued Fauci, sued HHS, and said, can you produce any of these files? Because how can you be mandating a product to children when you do not know what its risk profile is? And after a year of stonewalling us, HHS came back with a letter and said, yeah, there are no studies. That letter is posted on our website. Anybody can, on Children's Health Defense website, anybody can go look at it. So that's the problem. You know, you can get effects, and if you look at this generation of children, they have the highest chronic disease rates of any children in history or any other nation. This is the sickest generation of kids that anybody has ever produced. You know, the level of autism has dropped in this from 1 in 10,000 in my generation to 1 in 34 in this generation. And then there's all these other diseases like OCD, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, Tourette syndrome, ASD, et cetera, that are an epidemic in this generation of kids. Allergic diseases. I never knew anybody. I had 11 siblings, 70 cousins. I never knew a single person with a peanut allergy. Why do all my kids, I have 7 kids, why do 5 of them have allergies? Well, allergies are listed as, all those neurological disorders are listed as vaccine side effects. Allergies are listed as vaccine side effects on many of these vaccines. So and then the autoimmune diseases. I never knew anybody with Crohn's disease, never heard of it. Rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile diabetes, all of this incredible explosion of autoimmune diseases that are now debilitating this generation of kids. And all of them are listed as vaccine side effects. All of them began around 1989 when the vaccine schedule exploded. And, you know, I think Americans should be asking the question, are these coming from the vaccines? We know they're not. We know they're coming from some environmental exposure. And it could be a combination of, you know, a conspiracy of all kinds of environmental exposures, from glyphosate, from neonicotinoid pesticides, from atrazine, from, you know, PFOAs that are in our furniture and in children's pajamas, from cell phone use, and, you know, all of these things that are afflicting our kids. Our kids are swimming around in a toxic soup right now, but it's easy. We know there's a limited number of culprits. We know what they are. And the problem is NIH will not allow anybody to do those studies.
So if anybody would like to go deeper, I will throw the website and the links to your work in regards to vaccines down in the description box below. Now, I'd like to shift gears a little bit. Inflation right now, for the last year, has been quite out of control. If you were in office, what would you do in regards to inflation? And I'd like to specify that question a little bit. With what's happening with the BRICS nations, they're developing their own gold-backed currency. The US dollar is beginning to kind of wane as the global reserve currency. What would you do in regards to curb inflation, specifically with the energy sector? Would you pan anything back to the US so that we're not reliant on other nations in case, you know, the US dollar actually loses its world reserve currency status?
If we lose our reserve currency, we will see an apocalyptic collapse of our economy, and it's very, very dangerous. What we're in, including the Iraq War, the Ukraine War, is, you know, part of this scheme of things that we're doing with our foreign policy that's causing us to lose, causing our currency to lose the faith and credit of other nations. Brazil's already moving off of it. Argentina's moving off of it. Saudi Arabia is moving off of it. All of them are now moving toward using the Chinese currencies. The root of inflation is that we print money, and we don't have a base currency. And, you know, fiat currency, which is just paper money, it was invented so that so nations could go to war without really getting permission to go to war, because they don't. Otherwise, they'd have to go raise taxes, and people would be making sacrifices. The war in Iraq in 2001, we had these neocons moved in this clique called neocons that moved into the White House. And they were not liked by the conservatives or the liberals, but they were very, very belligerent foreign policy. And they tricked us into a war in Iraq, which a country that never did anything wrong to us. And we spent $8 trillion on that war and its aftermath in Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, Libya, et cetera. And on that war, the outcome of that war is that we left Iraq worse off than we found it. We killed more Iraqis than Saddam Hussein. We created ISIS, and we pushed Iraq into becoming a proxy of Iran, which was the outcome we've been trying to avoid for 40 years. We flooded Europe with 2 million refugees, which destabilized democracy all over Europe and caused Brexit. So that's what we got for the Iraq war. Now we're in another war that we're with the same neocons who were exiled at that point, somehow made their way back into the Biden administration. Victoria Nuland and Anthony Blinken and Avril Haines, and they're now dictating policy to keep us, getting us in another war, which is another proxy war that, the poor Ukrainians are now the victim of that war. We've killed 350,000 Ukrainians.
How would you end that war if you were?
I would end it. The Russians want to end it. Now, that war could have been settled on day one just by signing the Minsk Accords, which the Russians had agreed to. The Russians were pushing us for a settlement that would keep Donbass as part of the Ukraine. Donbass voted 90-10 to leave and go into Russia. And the Russians said, no, we don't want you. We just want you to make sure the ethnic Russians in Donbass are safe. They're not being murdered by the government that the U.S. put in. We overthrew the government in 2014, the elected government, put in our own government, which then basically mounted a civil war against Donbass. The Russians didn't want to go in there. The Russians wanted us to sign the Minsk Accords, and the Ukrainians wanted too. The Ukrainians voted overwhelmingly for Zelensky. Zelensky, who is an actor and a comedian, the reason that he ran, that he won with 70% of the vote is because he ran on a peace platform. He ran promising to sign the Minsk Accords. And then he was bullied by the neocons in the White House and by some ultra-fascists in Ukraine who instead go to war against Russia. And, the neocons wanted it because because it's their ambition to do regime change in Russia. President Biden admitted that. He said, our intention is regime change in Russia. And Lloyd Austin, who is the Secretary of Defense, said in April of 2020 that we are over there in order to exhaust the Russian army and degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. And so that's not a humanitarian mission, and it's not good for the Ukraine. We're killing all these Ukrainian kids for the geopolitical machinations. Back to your question, it cost us $8 trillion in Iraq. Ukraine is costing $113 billion. We have to print that money. We have to borrow $6 billion a day from the Chinese and Japanese in order to pay that debt. We don't have that money, so we have to print it. And that's what, and then, of course, the lockdowns cost $16 trillion. Oh, you add that up, $16 trillion for the lockdowns, which we got nothing for, and $8 trillion for Iraq. And that means that we had to print $24 trillion that we didn't have. Is there any wonder that we have inflation? Is it any wonder that we don't have a middle class left in this country? We need to end the warfare state. We need to close the bases. We got 800 bases abroad. We have to print $1.3 trillion a year to pay for our military budget and for the, the security state that we've created because of the military. The military adventures abroad are not making us safe at home. They're making it more dangerous to be an American. It's the opposite of what everybody wants. And so we need to bring we need to bring that money home, and we need to rebuild our infrastructure in this country. We need to rebuild our industrial base. We need to protect our borders. We need to make America again the shining city on the hill to the rest of the country and project economic power abroad, which is what the Chinese are doing, rather than military power.
Can I ask just one more question? I know somebody's giving us the go.
Yeah.
This one has come up over and over and over again, maybe 20 times among the people who asked. So this is what the question is. Please ask RFK Jr. about his policy on firearms, meaning the Second Amendment. I want to support him by donating and purchasing merchandise from his campaign, but won't until I know his stance on 2A. So,
yeah, I support the Constitution, and that includes the Second Amendment. I'm not going to take anybody's guns away. And I think at this point in history, all that would do is to increase this toxic polarization. You know, I've grown up in rural areas my whole life, and I know how much gun culture is integrated into those cultures. And it's existential for those people, for, you know, people who live in those areas, and that has to be, you know, and it's part of our Constitution, the Second Amendment, the way the Supreme Court has interpreted it. I think we need to end the mass killings, and we need to look at other issues. We need to look at the role of psychiatric drugs, particularly of SSRIs and of benzos. And there's no good studies that have been done on that. And again, it's because NIH is blocking those studies. But there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that you know, listen, there's no other, all of those drugs have on their manufacturer's inserts may induce suicidal and homicidal behavior.
yeah, I saw some study where some crazy, like 92% of the mass shooters for the last 20 years of schools specifically were on SSRI.
I don't know if there's a good study that actually says that. I think that people say that. And there's reason to believe that, but we need a good study that shows that, and then we can address the problem. And of course, NIH blocks those kind of studies, but, you know, Switzerland has more guns per capita than the United States. And Switzerland has not had a mass shooting for 21 years. We have one every 21 hours. Something is happening in our country that has never happened before in history. There's never been a time in history when people walk into a room of children or strangers and start shooting people. Not in our country, where we've had guns from the beginning, and not in any other country in the world. Something has happened here, and you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that Americans take 3 times as many pharmaceutical drugs as other countries, as European countries, and those are Western countries, and many, many more than other countries. We have, you know, pharmaceutical, we have the 6th population in the world, and I think that, you know, a lot of the psychiatric issues that we're looking at come from despair, they come from alienation, and they're aggravated by those drugs, and we need to look at those connections and figure out really what is going on, because this is a new phenomenon. Before Prozac was introduced, you know, mass shootings were 1 in a million. And today, like I said, they're every 21 hours.
Would you support expanding red flag laws more so nationally? Red flag laws.
You mean for personal behavior?
For personal behavior, yeah, you know, like some jurisdictions, if you file a complaint against somebody, the police can evaluate them and actually take away their firearms if they're deemed to be unsafe.
I would have to look at that. Okay. I don't really like snitch laws, but yeah, I mean, I just have a personal revulsion against snitch laws. But I would want to, you know, I would want to look at what kind of at how those laws are structured and what people are suggesting. I don't think you should be able to call the police up in this country and tell on your neighbors, but you know, maybe there's some other mechanism at place. I'm just uncomfortable with that.
Mr. Kennedy, thank you so much for your time.